The last hum. He had taken the corner table because it let him sit with his back to a brick pillar and a pane of glass at his elbow. He liked the scrim of steam that clouded the window when the door swung open and shed a little of the street. He liked the muddle of noise that rose from the counter and the tables like heat from a grill. The coffee here had a clean edge and the staff knew their moves, so even the clink of cups came with a practiced rhythm. It had been an ordinary reason that brought him out that morning. He wanted a place to read and to feel part of a working day without reporting to anyone. The book in his hands smelled of paper and dust and the thumbed oil of other readers he would never meet. The pages rasped softly and he liked that small grit of sound under everything, not a disturbance, but proof that the world ran on 1,000 minor frictions. He was halfway down a page when the air changed. The pause did not announce itself. It arrived like a door shut by a hand you never saw. The music that had been piped in from a small speaker above the pastry case cut off mid-bar. The song lost its tail and vanished. The grinder that had been snarling, the milk wand's hiss, the small bell someone had fixed to the hallway that pinged when the bathroom door opened, all gone. He did not hear the absence in pieces. He felt a slap of quiet, as if the room had been wrapped. He lifted his head too quickly, a vertebra clicking. The barista was still moving, a young man with a freckled forearm and a tattoo curling under the sleeve, and he kept moving as if nothing had shifted, but the motion had turned into a silent pantomime. His lips shaped a word, and the word made no landing. A plate fell somewhere near the back, or he saw it fall without hearing it, because the ceramic shattered like an idea in his mind rather than in the air. A woman at a two-top with a laptop opened her mouth in a shape that surely meant a curse, and reached for napkins. And all of this occurred in a film that refused to admit sound. He watched them all in their narrow actions, as bodies do when they think no one is watching. He heard nothing. He heard so much nothing, it felt like a noise. Outside, traffic went by with mouths open. He saw a man on the sidewalk speaking into a phone with an urgency that made his jaw jump. And the phone did not answer him with anything a human ear could use. There was a decision inside the quiet, he realized. It had chosen the room, the block, the angle of his life at that hour. He put one hand flat on the table to feel the nap of its wood grain and discovered that the texture had thickened into meaning, as if deprived of hearing his palm had become an ear. He looked around for someone to catch his eye and share the absurdity. A boy at the far end of the café was telling a story with both hands. A pair of students leaned in, their shoulders meeting, their faces bent as if under weather. A man in a pressed jacket tugged at his sleeve and checked his watch and mouthed a string of words that would have been soothing in an ordinary morning. The barista, he of the tattoo, turned the knob on the espresso machine hard enough that the body of the machine shivered on the counter, and the shiver made no sound as it crossed to the glass case, and the spoons in a white crock trembled in sympathy, and still the air held. A woman laughed and showed the curve of her molars and made no sound at all, and that, more than the plate or the machine or the traffic, turned his stomach. Laughter's shape looked wrong when it did not carry. The terror did not arrive as a scream. It took his breathing first, shortened it. It climbed the rungs of his ribs one by one and sat comfortably when it reached the top. He moved the book off to the side and slid his chair back an inch, and the chair skated over the tile like a blade. He saw the movement. He did not hear the scrape. He stood, the blood in his head rushing behind his eyes with a distant surf. The door to the street caught a reflection of himself as he moved toward it, and the reflection looked thinner than he liked. He pushed the door with his palm. Out on the sidewalk, the quiet kept its hold. People were talking to each other with earnest faces, and every gesture exaggerated itself to compensate. A dog at a bike rack opened its mouth and worked its tongue and panted, and the panting had the shape of a sound while refusing to be one. Behind the glass, the barista tried a string of buttons on the register as if he were calling an elevator. This was not a gentle silence, not a power outage or a paused song. This was a cut. He felt at once that it could be filled at any second, and the filling would not be a return of the usual. The certainty came with an animal logic he did not question. If the world had a voice, it had been taken. Something waited to speak in its place. He reached for his phone because that is what the hand does. The screen lit and told him ordinary things. The name of the day, a handful of icons, the ragged fringe of reception. He called a friend out of habit and watched the numbers count across without hearing the ring. He saw the word connect and saw his friend S's name and a timer begin, and watched it without sound for a long half breath. He said his friend's name. His own voice did not reach his ear from his mouth. It moved through the bones of his face and chest and came back to him muffled, like a thumb over a bottle's mouth. He hung up because he could not bear to watch the timer without sound. He opened the voice recorder instead and spoke his name and the day and the place into it, and then played it back and moved the phone to his ear. He heard a sound in the phone then, thin and damp, as if he were listening through water at the bottom of a glass. But it was not his voice. It was a smear. He closed the app. He set the phone on the table beside his book and placed his palm on the device as if to keep it from saying anything else. He tried to laugh once the way the woman had laughed, to feel what it was like to make the shape and not hear it. The shape hurt. His chest did not agree. He decided to stay seated because standing made him feel like a lighthouse in a storm, and the glass walls did not love him back. When the new sound arrived, it did not push the silence out. It grew inside it, as if the quiet were a stage and the sound had been waiting in the wings since the first boards were laid. It began as a low drag at the base of the skull, like a shovel biting into gravel. It came as a pulse, a slow grind with a regularity that made his teeth feel old. It did not come from the espresso machine or the street or the speaker above the pastry case. It came from everywhere and nowhere, like a fault line. Under the town had opened a small amount and decided to stay open. He felt it first in the bones near his ear, and then in the skin of his forearms, and then in the soft middle of his chest. It rasped. It drew breath the way a heavy door draws itself over a threshold. His fingers wanted to rise and cover his ears, but it would have been an empty act. The sound did not live where you could block it with skin. He looked at the others to see if their bodies knew it too. The barista had his hand on his own throat, as if checking the weather there. The woman with the laptop went slack and then fixed her face, which seemed to him a kind of mercy she gave herself. The students looked at each other, and one of them said a word with slow care. And he did not hear the word, but he read something like, all right in the mouth, a hope offered like a coin to a machine. The dog by the rack made a small bounce of confusion, the kind dogs do when something lands on the earth and they cannot find it with their fine tools. The grind deepened. The new hum came into the room with a presence that made the glass quiver one hairline and return. He watched a line of water on a tabletop shake and settle. He placed his hand on his own cup. The ceramic trembled with the room's pulse and left a half-moon mark when he lifed it. He tasted the coffee. It had gone metallic. It tasted like it had borrowed a spoon. He set it down as if setting it down were an answer. The vibration throttled itself for a breath, then came back slower, stronger, like a choice made. When he was a child, he had once put his head on the washing machine while it ran its spin and felt the world through pressed bone. This had the same logic, but with a malice the washer had never had. He took the book in his hands and knew he could not read now. The words would not hold. He watched the ink pressings turn into shapes without slots to accept them. The new sound, the slow grind, was not interested in words. It was interested in the right to speak through the body. He thought of the old stories of whistles, that only some animals hear, of sensors placed in ceilings that spin out tones, while thieves with earplugs go about their work, of machines that talk to pipelines with clicks and gauged pressures and do not require air to carry their news. He told himself that the hum could be a utility gone wrong, a transformer complaining on a scale above hearing that had slipped down into human space for a small time. This was a tool he had learned in a life of ordinary problems. Name a technical cause and the mind stands down. But the cause he tried to name slid away, and what replaced it was a picture of a mouth placed where the sky should be. The grinding came into focus. It became a throb, like a slow heart. It made his teeth grow furry in his mouth, and the strands of his hair pulled scantily at his scalp. He opened his eyes very wide because he could not control anything else. The barista had put both hands on the counter and was breathing with his mouth open. The woman with the laptop had shut it and laid her hand on it like you lay your hand on a pet in a moment when you cannot help it. The students had stopped pretending to speak and sat with their heads bent as if in a small prayer. On the sidewalk, a cyclist had stopped with one foot down and held his helmet with one hand, not out of courtesy, but to tell his fingers that some objects remain what they were a moment before. Then it grew human, or that is how he thought of it. The grind possessed a sense of articulation, like syllables far too big to house in any mouth he knew. It swelled and rolled and made small dips into shapes that felt like words from a language he had once been close to and then forgot. The offense of it made his eyes water. He thought of those early hours when trucks idle outside loading bays and make their diesel songs, and the sleep in you twists away from it, and he thought, no, it is not like that, because this had direction. It was a beam. It chose heads and went into them and tried their rooms. The glass on his table quivered with the next pass. He lifted it and found his hand shaking, and it was not fear in the common way. It was the body out of tune with something so strong it could write over the little rhythms of a hand. He placed the glass down again, and it tapped a note he could not hear, a small circle of water announcing itself to no one but him. He had the thought then, a simple, hard thought without flourish, that the world's voice had been replaced. If the world had always been a chorus, a packed house of mechanical and animal and human sound, that crowd had been ushered out, and a single speaker had stepped forward and taken the stage with a slow grind. It made his eyes want to close, not because of pain, but because of the suggestion in it. Lay down. He kept them open. He set both hands on the table again and anchored himself to the wood and thought in plain words, stay. He rose with care and stepped through the room. He found the barista's eye over the counter. The young man nodded once, a very small nod, and in that nod there was a deal. The barista's chest lifted and fell in visible counts. He reached for a carafe, filled a glass with water, set it on the counter religiously, and the glass slid a finger's breadth on the condensation when he let it go. He smiled a strange smile, not an expression of joy or politeness, but a reflex telling his mouth to do something human for another human to see. He tried to say something, and the shape his mouth made was a common shape. Okay. And the word fell wide of the ear and landed inside his head like a stone. He took the water because it was there, and because hands liked to be occupied. He sipped it even though he could taste the metal thinness and the faint chlorine that rose like a ghost. He felt it go down and count itself in his chest. The grinding, the new voice, went on. The woman with the laptop stood slowly and buckled her bag and touched her own throat, curious about the body's column where the voice had once passed. She put one hand to her ear because somewhere inside we all believe some sounds return if the hand invites them. She let the hand fall and looked at him, and then at the door, and then out at the street, and then down at the tile, as if floors could answer when the air had been confiscated. He went to the bathroom because that is where rooms become individual, and the body is persuaded that in a small chamber something global cannot reach you. The mirror looked like any mirror. The sound had not taken the silver out of the glass. His face was drawn a shade paler, and the crescents under his eyes had been penciled darker by alarm, but he was himself. He opened the faucet and watched water stitch a rope and break, and the room presented him with silence he could not head. And under the silence, the grind pushed through the sheetrock fine as a saint's thread through linen. He turned the faucet off because doing so put a small lever back into the world. He stood with his hands pressed flat to the porcelain and breathed through his nose until the urge to run had moved into the space above his shoulders and sat there like a coat hood on a day too warm for it. He returned to the main room. He thought briefly of leaving, of stepping into the street, and joining whatever silent convoy would form as people tried to outpace a sound living in their heads. But there was nowhere to outrun to if the air itself had been bypassed. He sat again and set the book before him and laid his palms on the plain cover and let his mind run like a dog on a long line until it tired itself and lay down. The grinding softened in order, but not in force. He felt it settle into a pattern. It had the persistence of a new appliance that has just been installed wrong enough to never reconcile, the kind that the installer swears is within range while you learn to live with its character. It surprised him that he could still think in analogies. He took comfort in the small capacity to shape thought with familiar tools. The book lay open now, not to the story, but to the flyleaf, because he could not trust the story to stay put while the room shook slowly around it. He wrote his name on the blank paper because a book likes to know who holds it. He studied the letters a long time, as if they were instructions. Someone tried the door then. The chime above it made its usual bounce and delivered nothing. A man in a work coat stepped inside and removed his cap as if there were rain and there was not. He stopped after 3 steps. He felt it in his temples the way the rest of them had felt it. He pressed his lips tight until color left them. Then he moved to the counter and gestured with 2 fingers, and the barista made the coffee not to be heard, but to keep the game. The cup arrived. It slid a fraction. The man lifted it with both hands, as if lifting a thing made of thin glass. He sat and stared at nothing and drank, and his throat moved like someone considering a question and deciding to answer later. Hours fell without ringing. Time turned into light, shifting across surfaces. The new hum droned on, sometimes lifting its note and then deepening it again, as if taking advice from some instrument master no one could see. He thought of power stations and turbines and long belts singing over wheels, and then he thought, no, stop naming it that way. If the mind held on to the tool of explanation long enough, it might break at the seam. Late afternoon slid in and laid a dull stripe on the floor. He had not eaten since morning, but his body was not convinced it needed fuel while a new voice worked the room. He forced himself to a sandwich pulled from the case by the tattooed barista and brought to his table with professional efficiency. He chewed without sympathy for the bread and the cheese and the tomato. He made himself do it to prove that the jaw could still serve its old purpose. The chew had a rhythm unlike the grind, and that gave him joy in a grim little way. After, he drank water again. He watched the cup leave circles. He arranged the napkin into neat squares. As evening began to imagine itself, the grind took on another color. It felt lower, more settled, as if the speaker had found its seat and now spoke at a level it could keep through the hours. He discovered he could guess when the next throb would come. In certain spans, it surprised him still. It never vanished. When his eyes closed, short and involuntary, he heard it inside his head, not as a sound that traveled down the canal, but as a presence that rose from the floorboards of memory. It knew his childhood washing machine. It knew the rattle of a truck outside a window he had slept under for a string of worn-out months in a town whose name he could no longer recall. It knew the compressor in the plant, where he had worked a year too long, because quitting would have meant admitting to himself that he had wanted someone to say he was needed, and no one had. He tried to imagine waking tomorrow to the old world, and could not. The old world was not a single clean thing to return to. It had been a heap of sounds no one conductor owned. This thing that now spoke, this slow, grinding voice, had no respect for heap or choir. It wanted a solo without air. Night took what remained of the window S-color and gave him back his face reflection with the room pasted behind it. He saw himself as a page in a book with the words smeared by a wet thumb. He could not leave the cafe because the street outside had taken on the tone of a stage where a cue had been missed. And now actors walked through a scene apologizing with their eyes for having to continue without the cue. He stayed. He became an object among objects. Table, chair, cup, man. He found that the body could accept this if asked gently. He told his muscles they would be still. He let his breath pace itself with the new hum, not out of surrender, but because to fight the big drum with a small drum tired both for no gain. When the first other sound came back, it came like a mercy and a proof. It was not a voice. It was the soft slide of cloth across cloth as the barista leaned his hip against the counter and shifted. He did not hear it with his ears. He felt it as a friction across the planet that had chosen to make a note right there behind the glass. He lifted his head. The barista looked up in the same instant as if some cue had passed through both of them, and he smiled for real this time and opened his mouth and said, or formed a single word that needed no air to land, "There." They both nodded like men who have just seen the first sign of land from a ship's rail after too long at sea, and neither of them believed yet, and neither of them wanted to be the first to believe, and the grinding voice went on at its appointed pace, and the cafe held them both, and the glass trembled again with the next long syllable that was not a syllable at all. He stayed until the dark had rooted. He rose then, slow and deliberate, and gathered his book and his phone and his jacket. He met the barista S.I. and pressed his lips into a line that meant gratitude more than any card could say. The barista tipped his chin. The door opened under his palm, and he stepped into a street without sirens, without the squawk of a bus brake, without the sharp cry of the men who hauled pallets down the side alley. A woman at the corner tried to start her car and turned the key, and the engine engaged, but the engagement had no sound in air. It only shook the hood and touched the hands on her wheel. She looked at him across the small distance with wet eyes, and he lifted one hand to show he was made of the same fabric and not something else. She nodded as if he had delivered directions. On the walk home, he learned the new map of the city. He learned which corners made the grind intensify and which made it thin. He learned that empty lots gave it room to drop and climb, and that brick held it differently than wood. He learned that under the old railway bridge, it became a braid of notes the ear would have called ugly if the ear had been in charge. He learned that his own head made an echo chamber for it when he lowered his chin, and that when he looked up into the grey, he could make it pass over his skull like weather. He went slowly because there was no reason to hurry. He watched a boy on a stoop reach for his mother's hand, and she gave it, and their fingers, laced like people in a photograph, meant to stand for steadiness. He thought, with a practicality that surprised him, that if this continued, he would have to try to work with it, the way you work with a neighbor's habit of hammering long past dusk. You do not ask it to stop, you find a way to place your hours around it. At home, the apartment held its shape. He unlocked the door and stood in the entry a moment and listened with his bones. The refrigerator in the small kitchen seemed to defer to the new sound. the way a small dog seeds the walkway to a large one. He turned on the lamp near the couch, and it made its color on the wall. He set the book down and washed his hands, as if washing could adjust anything, because it is what you do when you do not know what to do. He poured water in a glass and drank half and left the other half on the table, as if someone would need evidence that he had been here and had paused and then had gone on. The grind did not part in sleep. It stood beside him like a heavy piece of furniture while he lay down. It spoke in the place where dreams try to make their own rules. He saw a huge wheel and then corrected himself. It was not a wheel, but a mouth that had chosen to be round because the round is a simple shape. He saw the mouth take in towns, not by eating them, but by convincing them to come closer. He woke with his heart punching his ribs in a quick little burst, and opened his eyes and thanked the dim ceiling for being the least ambitious thing in the room. He lay breathing the way men breathe who have pulled themselves out of water onto a dock and chosen to let the dock be what it always was. He felt the slow grind work under the dock and knew it had no dock of its own and took what was there, and knew too that his body was not the last shape it would choose to speak through, and he felt a small mercy then, slow and tired, that he would not be alone in what the world's voice had become. Morning found the city grey and shy. He walked to the window and lifted the blind with 2 fingers and looked out at the street. People moved with the deliberation of those who have slept in the company of something that does not sleep. A man in a delivery truck rolled a dolly down a ramp, and the wheels made their rotations without singing. A woman locked a bicycle and tested the lock twice with a tug that told him she still believed in the ritual of checking. A cat leapt to the top of a brick wall and stood with its tail high and its ears laid back at the new noise only it could locate with any precision. He lowered the blind and went to the kitchen and made coffee. The kettle screamed in his memory. In the room, it only made a pan of motion. Steam rose with grace and touched the light and went to nothing. He drank the coffee black, and it tasted like ground penny. He ate toast, and it crumbled, and he felt the crumbs fall like a handful of sand placed in a paper bag. He sat down and wrote in a notebook. He numbered nothing. He did not try to account for hours. He wrote that the voice was not a song. He wrote that he would stop trying to give it a purpose, because purpose is a comfort humans build when they cannot accept that some things refuse to wear any dress at all. He wrote that the cafe had held steady and the barista had done his job, and that this, more than any counsel or alert, mattered to him. He wrote that the book had his name now, and that names mattered when voices did not. He planned to return to the cafe because he wanted to see if the room could carry the weight again. He wanted to carry a little of it with him and put it down there, as if rooms could share a load. He slid the notebook under the lamp and stood and took his jacket and stepped into the hall. The grind traveled there too, leathered and low, thrumming through joists and plaster and the thin seam between door and jamb. He locked and walked the stairs and put his hand on the rail as if taking the pulse of a living thing. Outside, the pale day had the look a sky gets when it cannot decide to rain. He went toward the corner that would take him to the block with the bright awning and the brick pillar and the table by the window where he liked to sit with his back protected. He went because there is a settlement to be made with any new voice, and if he could not mute it, he would at least stand where he had first learned its character and look it in the face without ears, and say in his head, where no one else could observe, "I hear you." He would pretend that hearing counted for something. He would keep his hands close to the table for the next tremor. He would meet the eyes of the freckled barista and watch the small nod return. He would live in the hum until he forgot there had been any other, because bodies are treacherously good at forgetting, and because some kinds of peace do not arrive when sound does, but when resistance thins into a habit, and habit into a kind of listening, even when no room can carry the voice you remember. He reached the corner with the bright awning and saw the cafe already drawing a slow thread of bodies through its door. People moved with the mild choreography of regulars. No one spoke, but mouths still worked and shoulders still shrugged at small snags, and hands still performed their tiny kindnesses, holding a door, steadying a tray, passing a napkin. He felt the grind before he crossed the threshold, the low throat of it slipping along his bones like cold water finds the ankles of a man wading without meaning to. Inside, the same hum swelled until it pushed right up against the edges of his body. He took it into himself, the way you accept a heavy coat on a day that has decided the weather without asking. The barista of the freckled forearm saw him and lifted his chin in greeting. Their nods had a weight now that a spoken hello had never carried. The young man flicked a towel across the counter and set a cup under the spout and worked the handles. The machine did its dance and refused the room any steam scream. A second barista, a woman with hair bent into a low bun, placed croissants on a tray with a sensible distance between them, as if they required space to breathe. Otherwise, it was morning as it had to be. People with bags, people with news they could not tell, people with a private need to be here rather than anywhere else. He took the same corner table. The book lay under his palm with permission. He could not read yet. The grind had its own text that bled across the page. He set the book aside and watched the door. Through the glass, he saw the slow river of the street, the cars a movement without voice, the bicycles painting their thin paths, the pigeons strutting like soft grey citizens with no care for any ordinance. A young man in a blazer and no tie broke into a jog as if late, then slowed, then jogged again, a body arguing with itself. A bus drifted into its stop and opened its mouth and breathed out faces that looked everywhere at once. He watched, and the watching did a thing to the noise in his head. It made it hold steady, as if the grind respected a gaze that kept its footing. He discovered he could eat. The first day had taken appetite and thrown it into a place that did not return calls. Now, hunger came back a fraction at a time from some side street, eyeing the scene. He lifted a spoonful of plain yogurt and slid it into himself and let the cool weight press down. The grind touched the spoon. It vibrated just enough to sing against his teeth without sound. He ate the rest by simple stubbornness, a man performing the maintenance that keeps an engine from seizing. The barista set a folded card near the register. He watched the regulars and the not-so-regulars who had made themselves into regulars overnight look at it because it offered a focal point. The card held a hand-drawn figure, not quite official, not quite a joke, somewhere in that useful middle. It showed a stick person with a line drawn from ear to a block labeled "The World," a diagonal slash through it. Underneath, in thick marker, lip read or write for now. Be easy with each other. He felt a hot gratitude for the lines. They were a thing you could put a finger under and follow, even if the following did not end in anything, but another minute survived. Minutes were light and shadow now. The grind wiped the small wristwatch noises off the map. The sun put its hand on the wall and moved it by inches. The barista kept his odd grace, and the woman with the bun smiled with her whole face at an elderly man who tipped an imaginary hat to her with fingers that trembled. Two students sat near the back and drew in their notebooks with fierce concentration, lifting their heads now and then to look at each other. The habit of collaboration refused to go down without argument. He pulled the notebook from his jacket pocket and began to mark. He did not write as someone keeping a ledger. He did not aim for control. He wrote as if for a person who would arrive after him and need a few plain lines to start a life. He put down that the noise lived in bones. He put down that rooms still held. He put down that, if you opened your hand and placed it flat on a steady surface and breathed, the grind adjusted its weight a little, as if accommodating politeness. He drew the shape of the café and a small arrow to the corner table, and he wrote in a flat hand that a man can be one of the objects in a room and still be himself, that the mind does not lose its border unless invited. The barista slid a cup toward him. The slide already knew the counter. He saw the line of moisture it left, a clean comma on the wood. He lifted the cup and drank and felt again the penny taste under the roast. He did not hate it. Metal meant infrastructure. Pipes still moved water. Lines still ran under streets and behind walls. He had spent one long year with a plant S-lungs and learned to take comfort from any sign that ducting continues to deliver. He placed the cup on its saucer. The tiniest tremor left a fresh ring. The café began to invent new skills. People spoke with their hands as if their hands had always known they were waiting for this day. A woman taught her friend a quick version of the alphabet in the air. A man wrote on a napkin and pushed it across a table when the friend's eyes would not stay on his mouth. Children whose bodies were tuned to find games in everything made a play of the silence that thinned the adult's fear. A little girl offered her mother a stack of sugar packets like cards. The mother pretended to deal them and bent her face to the child SS and made her expressions big enough to stand at a distance and read them like weather. There were the stubborn ones too, the people who kept opening their mouths as if trying to force sound back out by will. And when nothing came, their jaws tensed and their eyes grew shiny and they tried again. Because hope is a motor you can switch off even when it only spins a belt that goes nowhere. He stayed until the light went tall and thin. He walked home along streets that had not learned how to stop. The grind set up a relationship with certain blocks. It grew thick near a substation, ran high and odd under a pedestrian bridge, and sank to a lower gear in a small pocket of trees where the ground had been allowed to recover from concrete. He felt the different stations in his bones and made a crude map in his head. Here, relief. There, endurance. He passed an empty lot seamed with tall weeds and thought about how the city leaves its own negative spaces where sounds used to live and how those spaces draw their own kind of life. The grind, bored with the lot, skimmed it and moved on. At his building, a notice had been taped to the entry glass. It was printed in plain font by someone who knew people read only when they must. It said that the city office was in a temporary state of adjustment. It asked for calm. It advised residents to limit use of certain appliances to reduce electrical load since systems were recalibrating. It asked people to check on neighbors discreetly. It offered no theory. It offered chores, the only honest currency officials ever have in this kind of time. He ran his thumb over the paper as if pressure might thicken the ink. Upstairs, his apartment held some breath it had not held the day before. The grind was the same, but he had grown a shell for it. He watched his own hands move with an economy that would have pleased an old teacher. He washed his cup. He set it on the rack in a row with others. He brushed crumbs into his palm and took them to the bin like a man holding a moth he does not want to crush. He propped his book by the window and looked at the street and wrote one more line in the notebook: "Make small things sharp and fair." He did not know why he wrote fair. The word belonged to a scale he could not yet name, but it comforted him to see it there. The night told him the new voice would not sleep. It droned like a generator placed behind a wall, thin as a coat. He let his mind fall away from it a little by slicing the dark into familiar pieces: the square of window, the couch shape, the lamp with its pull chain, the folded jacket on the chair. The fridge kept its quiet contracts. It clicked, took breath, released breath, stopped. He lay on his side too long, and his arm fell asleep and woke with a warm rush that felt like a small miracle. He took the miracle without ceremony. The grind found the miracle and ran its hand down it and kept moving. In later mornings, the city pretended to have schedules. A bus came close to the time it would have come before. A teacher in a coat stepped out and opened the school's front door with a ring of keys and stood on the steps, like a figure in a story meant to reassure. Children walked past, strange in their solemnity, their jackets zipped to the throat, their eyes flicking to each other and then away. The grind did its work in their heads too. You could see the way it bossed their attention. In the cafe, the barista faced the day with a little sign clipped to the tip jar, gestures and notes welcomed. Be gentle. People did as told in that, if not in other things, for a while. He learned the new traffic of conversation. Two people could speak with their bodies and their notes, and stand in an agreement that satisfied some need. But when a third joined, the geometry broke. Triangles confused them. Too many eyes pulled attention, and the grind slipped its slow hand into the gap and made a smear of thought. He began to mistrust crowds. He hugged the edges of rooms. He kept his back to walls and pillars and shelves, not because of danger, but because stability runs out from a good corner like heat from a vent, and you can feel it in the meat. A few days in, or a pace that felt like days, a man in a suit set up a folding table on the sidewalk near the cafe and arranged a row of printed forms weighted with mugs. The forms offered lines to fill with names, addresses, whether the person could hear anything in the air or only in the head. There was a column for other sensations and a space where people could say whether they were able to sleep. The man handed out pencils and explained with his mouth and his hands, and people nodded and wrote in their shy, careful hands, and returned the pencils without connection to any system anyone could point to. The mugs clinked against the table when the grind took an extra breath, and no one heard it, and a dog sniffed the legs of the table with great ceremony, and then raised a leg, and its owner pulled it gently away without anger. At noon, a woman brought the suited man a sandwich and set it near his clipboard. He laid a palm on it for a moment as if blessing it. He did not eat it until after the small queue had thinned. Notices followed notices. A plain sheet appeared next to the first one on his building S glass, asking residents to consider keeping to a rhythm, lights on, lights off, to help the grid find its way. Another, later, suggested that those who felt overly taxed by the hum might visit a quieting station. The room number listed belonged to the basement of a municipal building not far from the river. He went there only to see, in a low room lined with folding chairs and a carpet that smelled of damp, people sat with their hands on their knees, and a staffer with tired eyes moved between them with paper cups of water. The grind found that room as dutifully as it found every room. Nobody pretended relief. They gave each other a place to sit and to be witnessed, that was all. He stayed less than an hour and stood near a pillar and watched the staffer adjust the thermostat higher and then lower, as if temperature might shape the pressure in their heads. On the fourth morning, he could take the book back up and not see the page as something blanked by the noise. He opened it to the middle and read a sentence 3 times until it stayed. The reading moved differently now, like stepping across stones in a creek you do not trust. He learned to catch the sound in his head that stood in for the author's voice and not let it be washed off its path by the grind. He worked harder. The work brought an honest tiredness that then made sleep more than a negotiation. On that same morning, the café's second barista hung a heavy fabric across the back corner of the room and pinned it at neat intervals so it draped without fuss. She placed a small note clipped beside it. If the hum throws your eyes, look here a while. People did. The cloth was a deep, steady color that asked nothing. The barista patted it as one might calm a horse. He felt a ridiculous affection for the cloth and for the barista, and for her practical faith that a piece of fabric could give the brain a wall to push against. He invited small repairs into his days. In the apartment, he tightened a faucet that had begun to leak. He oiled a door hinge until its movement returned to a silent click that was not the hum, not the grind, a separate mechanical courtesy. At the cafe, he offered to fix the wobble on a table. The barista shrugged an apology he did not owe for the time it would take a wrench to be found. He squatted and set his palm to the floor and steadied the nut under the table leg and found a compromise the floor and the leg could live with. The barista stood over him for a quiet and then touched his shoulder lightly, a thanks. Acts like that, small and square, held back something sloppier that wanted to pour through. The grind seemed to learn him as he learned it. It went to ground sometimes, as if crouching. He could feel its presence without pressure, a latent thing waiting like an engine idling. Then it would surge, heavy and certain, when the room grew loud with flailing gestures, or when he let his thoughts run long enough to forget about the discipline of their pace. It liked sloppiness. He could tell. He wondered if sloppiness tasted sweet to it. He refused, then, to give it sugar. He kept his notes plain. He kept his food simple. He cleaned the apartment in parts, not in fits. He made his bed not out of virtue, but because beds, when ordered, make a room into a place you can stand in without your feelings throwing elbows. He tried work. His old job at the plant had ended when the plant ended. The machines sold for parts. The men released into a tier of quiet that did not suit them. He had been picking up hours at a warehouse, slotting boxes, and the work had been nothing to talk about except in the way it gave the day a frame. He went to the warehouse office and found the clerk there with her hair in a coil and her eyes raccoon dark from the grind. She handed him a sheet with the usual matrix of hours and an extra line at the bottom. Please forgive any delays. The floor manager walked the floor with a small whiteboard on which she wrote block letters, slower pace, double-check labels, trust your hands. They worked around the hum, and the hum hung from the long roof like a brooding thing, and the forklifts moved with a caution that made them seem elderly. He liked the old sound of backing beeps in his mind, and found that his brain supplied it, a little childish phantom that kept his feet from walking into a machine aisle. In the break room, someone had pinned newsprint to a corkboard with a headline written in thick hand, "What We Know." Beneath it, columns of what we do not know were longer. The list held guesses dressed in polite language about technical anomalies and atmospheric events, and a line about shared phenomena that read like a handout a therapist might give at the end of a session. Someone had added a sticky note at the bottom, "Be kind." Someone else had stuck another below it, "To who?" The grammar wrongness made him smile because there was truth in it. To whom meant the old rules. To who meant the person in front of you right now, with their mouth doing its best to stand in for what you could not hear. Afternoons pulled him back to the cafe by a line he did not resist. Being with others made the grind less like a predator and more like weather you endure together under a shallow roof. The barista had started a small exchange, a basket of index cards and pencils, a line above them reading, "Tell us what you notice." People wrote in patient block letters and tucked the cards under the basket edge. He read them one by one, careful not to claim more than the moment. Some were practical. Ears ring more in the park by the river. Metal rail by the stairs feels like a live wire. Hummingbirds steer like tiny planes with new orders. Some were softer, dreams louder even with no sound, songs remembered in the chest better than in the head, hard to pray without noise to hold the words. One said simply, afraid to sneeze. He understood the fear. Sudden body noises felt like criminal acts under a regime of imposed quiet. On a late day when the sky sat dull and low, a van rolled to the curb, and two people in city jackets carried in a device on a cart. It looked like something made for supporting a polite lie, a square box with grill sides, a switch painted with a cheerful dot, a plug that promised usefulness. They set it on a side table and faced the room with bureaucratic courage. The older one, a woman with shoulders that told of years carrying things other people dropped, mouthed that the city had developed a countertone. She showed a small placard with simple instructions. Stand near, breathe, count with your fingers while we cycle it. The barista stood beside them, arms crossed lightly, not defensive so much as balanced. The woman flipped the switch. The device hummed in the old way, a mechanical thing making its willing best. The new grind did not fight it. The two sounds met in the room without touching. The device S-tone turned into a layer of polite cloth that did nothing to the stone beneath. The woman turned the knob and raised the volume to a level that made the café plaster pucker in memory of past noise, and still the grind was free. The woman nodded with her mouth set and turned the thing off and pushed it to the wall and took from her pocket a form. She wrote on it with a practiced hand and clipped it to the handle, and the cart went empty out the door. The barista placed a hand on the woman's shoulder and shook his head, and then lifted his hands in a motion that meant, to him at least, thanks for trying. The woman nodded once and left. The trial did something for the room anyway. It made doubt less lonely. People had seen the official shape of effort. They sipped their coffee and opened their books and wrote their notes and sat with their bodies in a place where a machine had failed, and the failure had the honesty of any good test. It did not need a press release. It needed a simple moment where nothing changed and you still stayed. His sleep turned strange that week. He dreamed in textures instead of narratives. He spent whole nights in rooms covered in felt in halls, lined with old velvet, where the grind could not get grip, and woke with his hands grasping at nothing, and a scent in his nose like warm dust in a theater. Other nights, he dreamed he stood in an industrial plant the size of a town. Its machines idle, the painted lines on the floor still bright, as if they had been laid yesterday, and somewhere a belt turned without being driven, and he walked toward it forever, and did not arrive. He woke from those with a taste in his mouth like copper oil, and drank water until the taste passed. When he could not go back to sleep, he sat on the couch and wrote sentences that did not try to be pretty. He told his page exactly what his body had done in the last hour. Breath steadied after a patch of rough water. Heart agreed to lower its shoulders. Hands ached and then forgot. He wrote it down like a man setting stones around a fire ring so flame would know where to sit. A letter arrived from a friend. It came in a plain envelope addressed in round handwriting with a line under his name as if to anchor it to the earth. He slit it open on his knee with his thumb. The first line took his breath because it looked like any letter from before. "Hope you're all right." He held the paper and let the grind wash through him because he could not fight it and read at the same time. And then he read slowly. The friend lived in a different city, not far by road, but now a world away by whatever made the voice. The friend wrote that the silencing had come there in fits, then had settled, the way winter sometimes rolls out of the hills and then goes back a step before committing. People there were finding their own cloths, their own index cards. The letter asked if he had anyone nearby. It told him, please, to be steady. It did not ask for a quick reply. It showed in the handwriting itself, in the pressure on the page, the shape of another human wrist making effort. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes and pressed the letter to his chest, and let the grind have the rest of the room, and kept the small warmth to himself, like a coal cupped. On an evening when a thin rain laid dots on the window and turned the streetlights into soft planets, he found the barista standing by the fabric curtain with his forehead against it. The man's hands hung at his sides, and his chest rose and fell as it must. He was not crying. He was out of cleverness. The woman with the bun stood beside him and lifted the edge of the cloth and smoothed it. He put a hand on the barista's shoulder, the way you write a tool on a bench to keep it from rolling off. The barista straightened and blew air through his nose and set his jaw and nodded once and went back to the counter. There, work placed its bridle on him again, and he moved under it in a way that looked like relief. The city made new habits. People cupped their hands to the base of their necks when a swell came through, as if encouraging the body to stand. They closed their eyes without apology in public, resting the outward sense that had been demoted. They learned to accept that some things would fall and break without noise. Plates, a vase in a shop, a coffee cup knocked by an elbow, and that the breaking had already occurred by the time any attention turned. They swept the pieces calmly and placed the pan down gently on the edge of a bin. The grind liked the crash of a thing as it left a hand. Deprived of that, it sulked a little and did not register small rebellions. He noticed this and stored it away the way a repairman notes a machine's petty moods. One afternoon, a man stopped in front of the cafe windows and began to act out a story. He was well dressed in a way that protected him from strangers' first judgments. He did not look dangerous. He used his arms as a conductor might, his face not for mimicry, but as if he were trying to push understanding into the glass with his brow. People look because stories are a scarce commodity when air cannot carry the decorative part of speech. He mimed a house with a roof, a family under it, a box he opened, a circle that might have been a plate or a wheel, a mouth, it had to be a mouth, making a slow movement. He formed with the careful push of lips the shapes that would have accompanied those actions, and nothing came. He went on until his breath ran short, and then he put his hands on his knees and panted soundlessly. A woman from inside brought him water and he drank, and then began again with smaller gestures until he exhausted himself a second time. He pointed at his ear and shook his head, and then at the sky and spread his hands. People nodded, as if that made any part of it easier to hold. He left, turning back once with a look that asked the room to carry some of the burden of what he had tried to say. It did. The barista wrote on a card, "Thank you for the show." The card stayed on the wall for a week. There were people who tried to profit. A man hawked small metal clips he swore would pinch the hum into submission where the ear meets the jaw. A woman offered glass beads she had made in her shared studio, smooth as river stones, blue as a cold morning, a bargain charm. He did not begrudge them their need to replace lost wages with something made by their hands. He bought a bead and pressed it often into the shallow, at the base of his thumb. It did nothing to the noise. It reminded him that glass can be coaxed into forms by flame and patience. The book he had been reading began to move again. He could keep a line, and then two. He began to underline not for posterity, but to fix his own route through. He noticed the particular luxuries the old world had provided without asking, the clean arc of a sentence rising and falling within the ear, the sly music the author had hidden in the order of syllables. He read now with the eyes alone, and the thought behind the eyes was less willing to play. He compensated by slowing. The pages grew heavier under their new piloting. He respected the book for bearing with him and did not resent it for the strain. In the warehouse, the manager added a ritual. Before the shift, she held up her whiteboard and wrote the date in words and then a phrase that meant nothing and everything: watch your hands. Over time, she added another: meet eyes. When accidents did happen, they happened in silence, and that meant they were discovered late, and programs inside the body had to be adjusted so that attention was a net thrown ahead of time. He watched the crew learn, one by one, with the wary sweetness of men and women who want more than anything to bring their bodies home intact. A gradual understanding stole up on him, slow as mildew in a basement corner. It was not just that the new voice had replaced the old, it was that it had a program for minds. It carried a steady suggestion inside its pulses, a whisper you could not call a whisper because it had no air, but that left a condensation on thought. Simplify. It pushed toward one-beat decisions. It disliked ornament. It wore out necklaces of dependent clauses and left plain blocks of need. It suggested that people were heavy and would be lighter if they slid into grooves. He pushed back with complicating acts. He boiled water and waited to pour. He chose a book with sentences he knew would take work. He sharpened a pencil slowly with a knife until the point was elegant. He said, in his head, no. The refusal felt less like defiance than like keeping a valve oiled. On a morning carved thin by cold, he left the cafe with his palms aching in that way hands ache when they have had to concentrate on carrying objects through a field of small startles. He walked along a block near the river where the city had once planted young trees, thin and hopeful as students, and they had grown into adults with their own humors. The grind seemed to thin there, either out of respect or boredom. He lifted his eyes and took in the shape of the far warehouse roofs and the way the sky had become one dull sheet without seam. He stopped to look because looking had become a workout, and just then a tremble went through the ground. Not the hums kind, but a fresh shudder. His knees loosened. He bent and braced a palm on the cold curb and felt under his hand a sequence of micro-vibrations, like a line of insects inside the concrete footway debating a change in leadership. It passed. He stood and went on. He wrote in his notebook later, "The hum has cousins. Do not assume it is alone." The cafe grew a shelf of little books written by its patrons on paper stitched with twine. He leafed through them carefully, elbow close to the table so he would not knock a glass. There were sketches of the room, diagrams of how people had moved their mouths to communicate, lists of gestures that had appeared like a small folk language. Someone had made a table of places where the grind peaked and dipped, as if mapping tides. Someone else had included a recipe for a kind of bread that rose without yeast, as a gift to those who might not be able to find the old packets. The woman with the bun had added a page of advice that had nothing to do with the noise and everything to do with weather. Salt your stoop when the wet freezes. Stack wood off the ground. Check on the person in the last apartment at the end of the hall. He copied that last line into his own small book, wondered who lived there, and decided he would find out. When he knocked on that door, a slow hand answered. The woman behind it was small and had the look of a person who has lived too long with cheap paint and thin walls and has refused to let either straighten her. He pointed at his ear, and she nodded as if this had only reinforced her low opinion of the world. He wrote on a card that he lived down the hall. She wrote back that her name was one of those solid names that had been out of fashion and then returned. She wrote that she had a radio in her bedroom she needed help moving. He read these words like promises. He moved the radio. It was heavier than it looked, and the cord had a resin smell from heat held over nights. She motioned to a table set against a wall. He set it there, and she placed a cloth over it the way his mother had once covered cold food, as if politeness could keep it warm longer. He stood there with his hands at his sides and watched her smooth the cloth. Then he left and felt the day notch more into place. The city learned to print in large type. Free papers once flavored with municipal gossip now ran simple guides. How to make signs for your building, how to mark stairwells so people could meet eyes easily, how to write a quick inventory of your apartment so a neighbor could enter and help if you failed to appear for 2 days of a new moon. People responded to the hum with a bureaucratic-making impulse that almost charmed him. When fear sits in a human throat, the hand drafts a form. He filled some out. He wrote that he had no pets and that he held no medication of interest to anyone but himself. He wrote that he could help carry, repair, replace small parts, and that he could watch a room for a set of hours with patience. He wrote that he knew how to keep quiet when quiet was called for. He pinned the form to the notice board in his building and tucked a spare in the edge of his mirror so he would see it and remember that being a person is a job. The hum did not relent. It did not tire. It shifted and leaned and learned the corners of rooms. It took advantage when someone overwhelmed waved their arms too broadly or banged a cup down hard and then stared at the cup as if the cup had betrayed them. It had preferences, and one of its preferences was to shove when shoved. He learned to stop shoving. He learned to absorb. He learned the way a boxer learns the line of a hook and meets it at the right time so his head does not whip. He thought it a poor way to live, and then reminded himself that men have lived under worse: the roar of river mills, the moan of bomb sirens, the stutter of animals in pain. Reminding was not minimizing. It was placing his own life in a shelf beside others, so it did not demand whole rooms. There was a day when the city's old noises tried to rush back through the skin of things. He could feel it, and so could the room. The grind pulled itself thin, and in the thinness he heard a sound in the café, not through air, but as a memory unlocked and allowed to play along the hinges of his mind. Laughter, bright and mean, from a table near the wall. It was not the current day's laughter. It lived in a loop, in the café's long muscle memory. It came from a night some seasons back, when a group had gathered before closing and had spilled themselves too far into the room. He watched the space where it had happened. He could feel where. And the echo played and then stuttered and shut. The hum returned from its thinness with a sterner face, as if to say, "That is enough of that." People felt it. A woman set her cup down slowly. The barista looked at his hands. He wrote in his book later, "The world remembers without us, if it has to." It was then he understood that his own head, which he had thought of as the last uncolonized square of land, had been moved slowly, foot by foot, into different soil. He had been careful with his thoughts, but the hum had been more careful still. He tested himself by watching the way he made metaphors. In the first days, they had run toward machines, belts, turbines, compressors, things that obey a human hand. Now they leaned toward geology, tides, mouths in rock, rivers that do not care to be named. He stood with his notebook open and wrote that down, almost as an apology to his earlier self. You hoped for a valve. What you have is a coast. He did not find a hero moment. There was no lever to throw, no cable to cut, no long speech to make on a chair in a public square to gather people into a plan. He waited for one longer than he would have admitted. Even after he had given up the overt hope, a small clerk inside his heart kept a drawer open, expecting a summons. When none came, the clerk straightened the papers and closed the drawer and went home. One evening, the barista slid a heavy envelope across the counter to him. He raised his eyebrows. The young man put his hand on his forearm and shook his head as if to say, "It's all right, not an injury, not a legal notice." Inside lay a stack of cards written in many hands, small square notes like the ones pinned by the basket, but older. The top card said in firm, cursive letters, "If the voice returns, keep this place steady." There were other lines like it, small bequests of duty. Some had names, some had none. One read, "Act like you were the keeper of a lighthouse, even if only for an hour." Another, "When you can, touch the counter and think of those of us who built it." He looked up to find the barista watching him, with eyes that asked something and offered something. He took the cards. He placed them back in the envelope with more care than his own name had received all that year. He understood. He did not know how to do it well. He knew he would try. The hum in his head gave a slow roll, as if bored by the transaction. He ignored it for once and let the envelope sit heavy in his pocket. Days reasoned themselves into a pattern. Work at the warehouse when there was work. Lunch at the café. A walk along the river block where the trees pretended the old world had not left entirely. Repairs small enough to prove the material universe had not repudiated him. Letters to the friend tucked into envelopes that he suspected would take the long way through the city's guts, reading them themselves before admitting any forward motion. Sleep like a canoe that drags on gravel before finding water. Dreams where his own voice spoke to him from a room next door and he could not get the door to open. And then the understanding, in the dream, that the door should stay closed. A winter came that was not yet printed on any calendar. It stepped down from the sky and put its careful hands on surfaces. The grind loved cold. It ran better in it, like machines love cool air. He put on the clothing he owned that had weight and watched his breath in the mirror out of habit and saw nothing because air without sound does not want to show you what you exhale. He salted his stoop half out of respect for the woman's advice, and half because the act of shaking salt, hearing nothing, grew his acceptance like a calf muscle grown by climbing. On a morning when the light was clear and the air smelled like a public swimming pool without joy, he unlocked the café because the barista had pressed a copy of the key into his hand the week before, with a look that said, "An if needs doing." The lock turned like a scratch on a record. He took off his gloves and placed his palm on the doorframe and pushed. The room received him with its mixture of resignation and solidarity. He set the chairs down from their nightly upturned stance, straightened a few tables, wiped the counter in long strokes that made the cloth pass warm over his skin. The hum did its low practice talk, and he let it. He ground beans. The smell took the corners of the room and made them rounder. He filled the carafes and placed them in their places. He thought of the notes in the envelope and the way someone had written, the counter, and he laid his hand flat upon it for a count the way a man counts when no clock is working. People came, as he knew they would. They offered him small notes for their orders, and he answered with small notes of his own. They paid, and he made change with fingers that could have done the work in the dark. They smiled with a gratitude that belonged to a ceremony older than any city office. The barista arrived through the back door with his hair sticking briefly up and his eyes bleary, and smiled with his mouth all the way. He took his place, and the two of them moved as pairs move when a shared task returns their mouths to them by way of palms and elbows and glances. The woman with the bun came in later, dragging a box with new cups and a stack of blank cards. She kissed the tips of her fingers and pressed them to the fabric curtain. He smiled at her, and she made a small bow with a comic flourish. They did not need voice for that. A man he had not seen before carried in a little radio on his shoulder. It must have been on before he entered, because when he set it on a table, it still had its small mouth open and nothing coming from it. The man turned a dial and watched a needle tremble with the old heart of seeking and then settle in a place where a station might have been. He nodded as if to say, "There you are," and then set his finger on the radio's casing and waited. The hum glanced off it and moved on. He left the radio there. It sat like a small animal, keeping a patient vigil for a master who has no intention of returning. No one tried to hush the radio. Hushing had lost its common sense meaning. A teacher sat near the window with a stack of papers. She marked them with a red pen and made notes in the margins that the students would have to read and not hear. He watched her write the old symbols he remembered from his own days, check marks, arrows, lines indicating reorder, and felt the humility of work brought low to a small table and still done with care. She lifted her head now and then and looked into the room with eyes like a swimmer S between strokes. Their gaze met once. She held a finger to her mouth, halfway to the old sign for quiet, and then dropped it and shook her head and smiled, a correction of herself. He saluted her with the smallest tilt of a cup. There was a sweetness in not playing performative games no one could hear. The hum learned his name, or something like it. On afternoons at home, when he sat with the book and the lamp and the steady rectangle of window, he could feel the grind shape itself not to syllables, but to the cadence of how he thought his own name. It would come at the beginning of a drift, lifting his attention like a close whisper, and then sit. He could not prove this to anyone. He did not tell anyone. He said inside himself what he had said before, no. Not a shouted no, there was no point in shouting, but the kind grammarians call declarative. The hum took the no as information and adjusted, as a good machine will. It came now at the ends of thoughts, suggesting a period. He allowed it that. Humans and their minds like to pretend they are alone in their punctuation. He was learning otherwise. Spring dragged itself into town and threw wet at everything. The cafe's big window ran with condensation. The grind hated humidity. It stuttered then. He and the barista and the woman with the bun learned to watch for the stutters. They were little reliefs. The way sun between clouds is not a whole afternoon, but still makes a shoulder loosen. People stepped into the room on those days, and their mouths moved more without saying a word. Hands fluttered. The thin sound of breath inside a head grew audible enough in a private way that some people closed their eyes to feel it. He liked those days, not because they promised change, but because they reminded him that even voices that declare they do not have to fight weather do. A man came in one wet afternoon and stood close to the counter and laid out 3 pictures from a small envelope. They were photographs of a river, mouth in flood, of a storm breaking over a flat field, of a stack of concrete blocks at a harbor mouth slick with spray. He tapped them one at a time with a forefinger and looked up, eyes searching for agreement, and in his gesture there was a thesis. This and this and this. Forces that do not ask, meeting borders that pretend to be permanent. The barista leaned in and looked at the pictures, and then at the man, and nodded with a slow grave that seemed to say, "I receive you." The man took the pictures back as if ashamed of their beauty and left them on the basket for anyone. He walked out into the grey day, coat buttoned too high, collar bent, a soldier from the wrong war. He wrote his friend a letter that weighed more than the others. He wrote that he had come to think of the hum not as a single voice, but as a practice, and that people are malleable in 1,000 minor ways we mistake for choices. He wrote that he was afraid, not of death or of pain, but of becoming a thing that did not ask whether it was choosing. He wrote that he worried he would forget the pleasure of a short, imperfect song carried on a bad speaker across a room. He wrote that he was never much for songs, and that now he missed even the ones he had mocked. He wrote that he was going to keep at the tasks, the coffee, the counter, the stoop, the neighbor's radio, and he asked his friend to visit if the friend could not, because a visit would cure anything but, because 20 minutes beside the river would install a right-sized picture in their mutual memory. He sealed the letter and addressed it and put a stamp on it and carried it to the box and slid it into the dark and felt the grind run its fingers along the box. S metal, and wondered if letters now made a sound only the hum could hear. The city sent 2 people door to door that month. He saw them through his peephole. They wore plain jackets and expressions of practical fatigue. They held small tablets and asked to confirm the number of residents and to make a list of notable needs. They had learned to write fast and look up often. He invited them in because the hallway held too much foot traffic, and he was weary of watching bodies flinch when a wave passed. They sat at his small table. He made coffee and set the cups down with care learned from 100 mornings. They asked for his name. He gave it. They asked for skills willing to be offered, and in exchange for this small pride, he asked for nothing. They wrote his words with hands that barely hesitated at the grind. One of them looked around his room and pointed at the note on his mirror, the one with his offerings, and said with her mouth, "Good." He saw it plainly. She stood and touched the table the way the barista had, and he added her to the silent ledger he kept of people who understood the sacredness of surfaces. It was after this visit that the change began to alter its scale. He had always felt the hum in his head. Now it raised a different muscle, tender and private. He would be reading or walking or watching the first clouds of yellow pollen slide down the street like a migrating cloth. And a thought would arrive that was not his, and yet felt as familiar as a memory from childhood. It told him small, practical things at first. Move your foot, don't take that street. Wait one more count before you lift the cup. The advice was not bad. In fact, it saved him from a stumble on a cracked sidewalk and a collision with a pallet loader. He recoiled anyway. He tested it. He tried walking the street it had told him not to take. He found nothing worse there than a man sitting on a stoop with his head in his hands and a loose brick that wanted attention. He tripped, as if punished, but knew it was his own distracted step and not any sentient law meeting justice. He stopped halfway down the block and made himself stand there until the breath eased off and his heart stopped making accusations. He wrote in his notebook later, "The new voice wants little control to become bigger, decline polite suggestions sometimes, even when sensible." The barista began to sicken. It was in his shoulders first, a set that never dropped. Then in his eyes, which fell out of focus when a swell of the hum came through and did not sharpen after. The woman with the bun took more of the shift load and never let her shorthand slip. He tapped the counter twice with his knuckle when the barista leaned too long against the back wall, and the man nodded and returned his weight to the work. He did not try to parent him. He knew the pride of a body that wants to remain useful. One night after closing, they stood at the counter and he opened the envelope again, and the three of them read the cards with the old bequests. The woman placed one card against the counter and smoothed it with her palm, as if the words could be pressed into the wood for later use. In that gesture, he saw how the room, in the end, would store what mattered. It would hold a portion of them the way barns keep warmth from animals long gone. The barista did not appear the next morning. His absence sat at the counter like a mug waiting to be filled. The woman looked at the door twice and squared her mouth and wrapped an apron string twice around her waist. He took a breath that was more like a swallow and stepped forward. He unlocked the till with the key in the tin on the back shelf. He checked the water tower, bled the steam wand not to hear the small sigh, but to feel the shiver it transferred into his hand, primed the grinder so it would not seize when asked to turn. The woman nodded once in a way that meant, "Do not perform heroics, do the steps, count the cups." They worked until the room had been fed and watered and gently handled. Then he went to find the barista. The young man lived in a rented room above the laundry a few blocks away. The stairwell had a smell that belonged to detergent dragged long across concrete and to heat held too close by a building that had been given no good vents. He knocked and called the man's name, with his mouth more to feel the shape than to deliver it. The door opened after some time, and the barista's face in the gap looked like an old picture of himself in poor light. He pointed at his head and made a sign with both hands that could have meant anything: too much, enough, wait. He wrote on a scrap of paper, "Tide." He meant the hum in its heavier runs. He wrote another, "Be there later." He walked away because to stand in a doorway pressing help onto someone is a kind of violence, and he had sworn in all this to do no more harm than his doubts demanded. Later, the barista came, pale but upright. The three of them closed the cafe early and sat in a loose triangle and wrote single words on cards and placed them in the middle: light, counter, cloth, beans, keys, people, names. The stack grew like a child's tower and then collapsed under its own unevenness. They smiled because collapse felt honest. They rebuilt with more sense. The woman collected the cards and banded them and wrote in careful letters on the band, "Inventory." He loved the solidity of that moment, the way naming objects, simple and near, set a circle around the room the hum could not erase. A windstorm came through, without the usual sounds, branches cracking, shutters banging. The day looked like a film of mouths and movements without the scoring. The hum became a chorus then, picking up the frequencies of 1,000 objects under pressure and dragging them into itself. His head buzzed so hard he could feel each tooth as if the jaw were a drawer with loose items rattling. He sat on his floor and held his own ankles and rode it out. When it eased, he stood and did the dull checks people do after storms. Window intact, roof not breached, plants on the sill upright. He went to the cafe by habit and found the awning flapping, its fasteners worried loose. He set a ladder and ascended and worked at securing it, each wrap of the strap a small victory against slackness. The woman held the ladder steady and looked up with an impatience that meant not anxious, only eager to get it right. He descended and they stood a moment under the now steady cloth and watched the wind settle into a sulk. He woke one night not to the hum, It was always there, but to the absence of his own thoughts in front of it. Usually his mind, like an old fan, the kind with bent blades, spins a little on its own no matter the weather. That night it had stopped, and the hum spoke with nothing to cross it. He lay on his back and let his eyes rest open, and found that if he directed his attention to the ceiling, faint irregularities, the mind began to turn again. He retrieved a small, silly thought, whether the corner needed paint, and the thought held just enough weight to give the hum less to harm. He became his own operator, starting and stopping the small machine on purpose so the big one would not find too much idle capacity. He taught himself that, and he wrote it down the following morning with grave clarity. Think on purpose. His friend sent a short postcard with a picture of a bridge. The bridge held a line of pedestrians in heavy coats, their heads down against a weather that had not been printed in the sky. The words on the back, ready-made, felt like a joke. The friend had written around them, "Hope you can keep the counters steady. Might come to see you if the trains decide on a bargain with the air. Some birds still sing if you hold your breath and remember hard." The last line knocked his chest. He stood with the card in his hand and thought of a bird on a wire in another town and another year, and his mother saying, "Shh, listen," and how the bird had cracked a tiny light over the morning. He did not cry. He set the card by the lamp and placed a glass on the corner to keep it flat. He was not brave. He was consistent. He found that counted more here. People kept coming. They wrote and nodded and made their small jokes with facial muscles that ached by evening. Older men shook hands with long pressure like farmers. Teenagers took to sitting in twos and threes with notebooks and inventing a blocky hand language that had none of the precision of the studied kind, but had all the speed of youth and worked well enough to make plans for afternoons that still held the possibility of sweetness. A woman wrote him a short note that said, "Gratitude, then a line for your way with tables." He did not know how to accept that, and so he saved it the way a man saves a foreign coin that cannot be spent, but has the weight of travel. In the warehouse, a new worker arrived who had not yet learned the hum's etiquette. He slammed a pallet down, and the hum caught the energy and used it to climb and shudder through a dozen heads. The floor manager wrote on the whiteboard in enormous letters, "Gentle." The new worker did not like to be told. He straightened and looked around at the faces and flushed, and a little muscle twitched in his jaw. The manager put her hand out, not for a handshake, but in the old universal sign for slow down. He stared, then lowered the next pallet in a controlled fall that spoke well of his upbringing. At lunch, he sat alone. The manager took her tray to his table and touched the chair opposite with 2 fingers. He offered it with his eyes. She sat and wrote a few words and slid the little board over. He read it and nodded. He softened a notch. No one cheered. The hum, bored with the absence of drama, kept to its schedule. The barista did not come in again 1 long week later. This time, he did not find him at the door. There was a note pushed under the jam in the morning, a line in the barista's hand that could have been the woman S if not for the backward angle of 1 letter. The note said, "Tired." The woman with the bun folded it once and placed it in the envelope with the cards as if tucking away a report from a colleague. He felt the pull in his chest that is not grief yet, and not anger either. He worked the counter and cut limes for water and wiped down the espresso heads with a rag. At closing, he cleaned the grinder the way the barista had shown him, with a small brush and a patience that felt like prayer. He left the light above the counter on the way. The barista always did a soft gold square in the room to greet the morning staff, whether or not the staff included the man whose rhythm had set the grace of the place. The day the voice shifted, he could not call it a change, only a re-aiming. He had been reading at the table by the window the way he had set himself to do. He caught himself mouthing a line to feel the weight of it without any air in the word. He lifted his eyes to follow a shadow across the street that turned out to be a cloud going about its ancient tasks. The grind opened slightly, not louder, not angrier, but wider, as if finding a new resonance in the city's long bones. He felt then that it did not merely occupy his head. It wanted, and what it wanted was to be the last narrator. It had tired of sharing. It wore a patience like a suit, the way officials do on days they have decided not to be argued with. He set the book down and placed both hands on the table to steady his own voice, where it lived not in his throat, but lower in the place where people store instructions for how to be when no one is watching. He breathed. He waited. He thought words slowly. He thought of the counters and the keys and the cloth and the names. He thought of the woman under the blanket of the hum in the municipal room and the staffer with tired eyes. He thought of the whiteboard at the warehouse and the new worker learning his manners. He thought of the pictures of the river mouth and the harbor blocks. He thought of how the barista had laid his forehead on the fabric curtain and been brave enough to stand there for a count and then return to work, which is the oldest form of speaking against a wrong that will not give way. He did not push back at the hum the way a child hits water and calls it a victory. He held a line instead. He did not know for how long that held. Time was a warm hand on the back of the neck, not a clock. The hum rose to fill him and waited, expecting him to be the same as all the vessels it had studied. He refused in the quietest way possible. He refused as a man refuses a coat that does not fit his shoulders. He refused by being occupied in another task, wiping, counting, reading, labeling, mending. The hum, like any force, tires of being ignored. It did not leave. It kept him company. Later, when he walked along the river, there was a moment where something like sound crossed the path. Not a noise, not a real one. A flicker inside the head that traced the shape of a bird's call. He stopped. It did not repeat. He did not build from it a theology. He did not write it down. He let it sit with him all the same, like a child on a bench swinging its legs, neither demanding nor dismissed. The seasons tilted, as they do in places where seasons still know their lines. Leaves thinned. The café hung a string of paper shapes in the window that nodded to a holiday without asking for the city to pretend its old gusto. A different crew came and went each day. The woman with the bun taught a new person to pour, so the streams looked like a steady way of writing a name. He went on wiping and fixing and taking the small bow he had given himself so he could accept, on behalf of a room, a duty that had not been awarded by any authority. He dreamed, one night when the air was the cold kind that makes the hum grow slick, that he stood on a high shore and watched water take back sand, as it always has. The water had a voice, and it was the hum. And in the dream, he accepted that the sea had always spoken this way, and the old sounds were a local dialect luxury, a nice thing towns had been allowed for a while. He stood with his hands at his sides and did not plead. He woke with a dry mouth and a heart like a tired fist, and his ceiling was where he had left it, and his lamp responded to the pull of its chain, and the glass on his table had a ring from the night before. He drank. He washed the glass. He made his bed. He turned the radio on and watched the dial glow and knew it was giving him nothing but light, and then, after a long minute, the tiniest static rose to meet the needle, a dry snowfall of electrons making their agreements, and he sat with that and took it like a blessing from a minor saint. The barista returned for a few hours one late morning. He moved with the lines of a person whose insides had been sanded down, every step a little studied. They did not load him. They let him do the small things. He wiped spoons. He stacked lids. He cut lemons. He stood beside the fabric and did not lean his forehead this time. He looked at the envelope with the cards and placed another card inside, blank. He said nothing. He used his mouth to choose the shape of breathing, and he did that well. The woman with the bun pressed her hand to his back for a moment, and he did not flinch. He left after a while with a two-fingered salute, and the door closed on him on them, the way doors in cities always do, and the hum continued its pale labor. He went home through a late light that dimmed the brick to a color like old bread. He unlocked his door. He washed his hands in the usual way. He placed his notebook on the table and opened it and looked at his own hand moving on the page with a patience that had become the only credible bravery he could find. He wrote down what he had seen and what he refused and what he would do tomorrow, even if no one came to thank him for it. He wrote that he would keep the counter steady. He wrote that he would check on the woman at the end of the hall. He wrote that he would lift a chair and put it down without giving the hum the satisfaction of taking its energy. He wrote that he would keep the habit of looking at birds and imagining their songs into his head, even if the hum disliked the competition. That he would think the songs on purpose, not to win any war, but to keep the musculature that once sustained a chorus from atrophying in his care. When he finished, he closed the notebook and laid his palm on it and felt the texture of the cardboard against his skin. The room was not quiet. The city was not quiet. They held the new thing the way a landscape holds a slow storm that has decided to make a camp. He stood and went to the window and lifted the blind and looked at the street, which was a street still. A boy ran. A girl held her mother's hand, a delivery person pushed a dolly, a man crossed with the light, and then remembered lights were only colors and smiled at himself. He swallowed and did not listen for any particular sound to follow the swallow. He breathed and did not expect an answer. He let the hum be beneath. He let his own mind supply the little top layer that used to be the world. He whispered his name into the hollow of his chest, where words still have a place to sit, and the hum, hearing the shape, if not the word, laid its own weight on the syllables and pressed down. He stood it. He stood still. He stood the way a man stands in a room he has claimed as a station and a duty. He turned out the lamp. He walked to bed. He lay down. And the last thing that crossed his mind before the hum smoothed it into sleep was not a sentence, but the picture of a counter, wiped to a dull shine, waiting for hands in the morning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.